They say that the first-generation immigrant zealously remembers and preserves their heritage. The second generation zealously forgets. But the third generation zealously rediscovers. And so we wish to rediscover the Holland we remember, a nostalgic Holland. The charm of the land is as rich as her food, and as intangible as her gray sunlight. No country in Europe is so quaint, so rich in picturesque corners. All over Holland, her tulip-covered fields, her canals, her windmills, the translucent silver of Dutch mist. It's as though you were looking at a gray-green world through a small, transparent pearl. And then there are the small Dutch towns, not the big ones, but the small ones, the cleanliness and quiet, with the air of the 17th century. Some of these places were built at the time of Columbus. The world has been shaken by tumult and revolt. Governments have risen and disappeared. But life on this little square of earth has placidly gone on. This is comfortable country. The great arms of windmills gyrate hilariously. The ditches are alive with ducks and swans, made more placid and gentle by the presence of black and white cows and snowy sheep. There is color everywhere as you drive the lovely countryside. As you travel from one village or vista to the next, the panoramas flow past your window, almost straight out of your old geography book. Now, I honestly think that the Dutch character has had a lot of bad press. When you look at the dictionary, there are phrases that have a prejudiced meaning. Like going Dutch means paying for your own meal. Or a Dutch barn, one without any walls. Well, maybe then there's the Dutch bargain, one that really isn't. They accuse the Dutch of having the good life without being able to appreciate it. It was always claimed that their staunch Calvinism could not keep them from sinning, but it certainly kept them from enjoying it. This is a country of churches, of peaceful believers and stern debaters who were tied to their religious landscape. Faith was a key pillar in the fabric of their society. A chief characteristic of a Nederlander is called bedaardheid, a true Dutch word that really has no translation, but can be defined as a sedate calmness. He will think things over slowly, almost to distraction. When he's having a good time enjoying himself, there's no show of emotion. They are slow and cautious, almost to a point of exasperation. Yet they always seem to get where they're going. Dutch history proves that simple fishermen of the Middle Ages became the famous skippers of world discovery. They were shrewd at times, selling weapons and ship insurance to their very enemies. When the pompous Queen Maria of France visited Holland, she made sure that her host, the burgomasters of Amsterdam, realized that her visit was a great honor for them. But she was quite shocked by their reply. They said, "You must not forget, mevrouw, that we too are kings, the kings of commerce." The Netherlands of long ago was a wet and dismal place, swept by furious winds, beaten by rains, and veiled in perpetual fog, where nothing could be heard but the roar of the sea. Most of the country is nothing more than a huge river delta built by the Rhine River over thousands of years, as it flowed all the way from Switzerland, making this place nothing more than a sandy clay swamp. The first pagan settlers here must have lived a wretched life, and if they escaped starvation or drowning, they were likely caught by Vikings to pack their slave galleys. In modern-day Holland, without the dikes, 60% of the land would still be underwater. They fought the river and the tide. First they built mounds, determined to protect the grave sites and later the churches, and finally the homes and land. Can you imagine the back-breaking labor? With bare hands, shovels, and carts, they raised the great turps. These patriots could honestly declare with legitimate pride, God made the sea, but we made the shore. Later, they built areas of dikes and ditches called polders. The word comes from an old German word pol, which were the stakes used to hold dikes and dams together. A polder is so uniquely Dutch that the word cannot be translated by any single word in another language. They took their war against water very seriously. A person guilty of intentionally destroying a dike would have his hand cut off and then banished from the village. It was a simple rule, wie niet meedijkt in nood, verbeert zijn erf. Who does not lend his aid, forfeits his farm. There is no truth to the story that a small boy stuck his finger in a dike to save his village, but there is a true and more heroic one. Near Rotterdam, during the flood of 1953, a sea captain saw a dike about to break. At risk to his life and the certain ruin of his boat, he steered his vessel broadside and perfectly plugged the gaping hole. Life in this land changed when the Crusaders came back from Palestine during the Middle Ages. They brought back new products and ideas. There were bulbs and flowers. There was gingerbread and spice cakes. They brought back church spires and church bells. Zaandam is a picturesque place, known for its bright homes and numerous windmills, but also for the curious fact that Peter the Great of Russia came here to learn shipbuilding from the Dutch. He stayed here for only a week. Here, among the finest shipbuilders in the world of that time, he learned ideas for his own navy. In modern Russia today, there are still nautical terms in the Dutch language. The Tsar was intrigued by the Mennonites, and he asked one of the pastors to preach a sermon, but he was told to make it short and snappy. The sermon was as follows: Dear brothers and sisters, think well, speak well, and act well. Amen. When you say Alkmaar, you mean cheese. It lives, breathes, and has its very being in cheese, a sight you will see nowhere else in the world. Every schoolboy here can tell you the story of this city's most famous battle. During their fight for independence, 16,000 Spanish soldiers stood outside the walls here. When the citizens refused to surrender, the Spanish captain told them, "If I take Alkmaar, I shall put the knife to every throat in the city." After 7 weeks of bitter fighting, William of Orange decided to cut the dikes and flood the city. Better a submerged land than a lost one, he said. The Spanish fled under darkness, their first defeat by the Dutch. Probably my favorite city in Holland is Kampen. It's an ancient place, named after the camps of the Roman army which now lie buried under this lovely city. The Rhine River flowed through here, but after becoming silted and shallow, the water changed direction, creating the town of Rotterdam. The city walls have long succumbed to the march of time, but a quiet medieval town still remains. As I stand taking in the dimensions of the old Grote Kerk here in Haarlem, I'm reminded of 2 events that happened. It was the worst of times during the War of Independence from Spain. The townspeople were about to cut their way through the Spanish lines, with women and children in the middle. The Spanish general promised them their lives if they would surrender, yet once inside the walls, the soldiers began their slaughter. 2,000 women and children, plus all the Protestant clergy, were cut down as they hid here inside the great church. Another incident happened about 200 years ago while the organist was practicing in the church. A 10-year-old boy came in begging to play the ancient organ, and when he took his place on the bench, such music burst forth as that church had ever heard. The boy's name was Mozart. Every Hollander enjoys the beauty of this 250-year-old pipe organ of 5,000 pipes. It remains one of the largest and most powerful in Europe. The builders of the Gothic churches in Holland suffered a handicap right from the beginning. Because they had only brick to work with, there was little stone in the entire country. Stone is of the very essence for great buildings. The flying buttresses and stone vaulting such as you will see throughout Europe are missing. Here in Holland it is brick. Brick everywhere, overhead, underfoot, and piled into great walls and massive towers. It would almost seem that the Dutch dug up half the country for brick, and for good reason. The Rhine River simply rolled this special clay to their very doorsteps thousands of years ago. And so, with a minimum of stone, the churches are not as beautiful, merely bare, shapeless masses of brick. And yet, when you look upwards toward the heavens, you can only marvel at the patience with which those millions of clay blocks were piled one on top of the other. This stately edifice rose straight out of the Middle Ages. Everyone attended church, whether they liked it or not. The floors were cold and damp. There was no heating. And to make matters worse, there were no seats. The people had to stand. And if that were not bad enough, most of what they heard was in Latin. After the Reformation, things were better. People had seats, even though they had to pay for them. The poor and less important sat in stiff wooden benches, whereas the folks of influence were seated in a more prominent place. You see many grote kerks throughout the country, and let me explain to you that this is really just a generic term. The oldest churches were Catholic, thus dedicated to some saint. Now, no Dutch Reformed church could be named after a saint, so now they are called grote kerks, or nieuwe kerks, or oude kerks. And when the great and new and old were exhausted, they went to points of the compass, the East Church, or the West Church. In the Netherlands, Christianity first came to the towns, which were then the centers of culture and education. In the small villages, the pagani or rural areas, the new teachings were slow in coming. Thus the word pagan was really just another word for people outside the city. People living on the wastelands and moors were called heathen from the word heath. Today, the words pagan and heathen have taken on a different meaning, probably because folks living in the rural areas were the last to accept Christianity. At the time of our grandparents, religion was the very center of life. Glancing at Deventer across the IJssel River, the Grote Kerk stands solid and unshakable. Its tower has witnessed the sunsets of 500 years. Its traditions of architecture seem as immovable as the eternal throne, while below is the symbol of all that is changeable and uncertain, the great flowing river as it surges past. Today, some of the oldest and most noble of churches are only museums, visited by only a few for non-religious talks or a concert or perhaps an art exhibit. However, Sunday, even today, has remained sacrosanct. There are no Sunday news. Television commercials become scarce. Most shops and gas stations are closed. And yet a Sunday visit to many small rural communities presents a scene that has little changed through the centuries, where the whole gemeente goes to church, from the burgomaster to the poorest farm laborer. In olden times, men dressed in black would pause outside the church, laying their prum or quid of tobacco on the windowsill, and later it would go back in either his own mouth or his neighbor's when the service was over. On Sundays they often wore the same costume as market days. Armed with peppermints and a gesangboek, they filed into church. The stovensetster or woman usher would show them to their seats. And if the weather were cold, she would give the women a warme stoven with glowing peat that sometimes, if damp, would smoke horribly, leaving a permanent odor in the woodwork, not to mention the heavy wool clothing. The Genevan Psalter was used exclusively. A certain powerful voice or voorzanger would lead the way. The singing went slowly, allowing the congregation to savor the beautiful familiar melodies. The sermon was the chief part of the Dutch service. It was almost always long, making it easy for the congregation to fall asleep, till the dominie raised or lowered his voice in a certain manner, an automatic wake-up call. Afterward, whole families assembled in their parlors to enjoy roasted preacher, a favorite pastime for every Hollander, because they, in their own right, were competent theologians, with a critical ear for every fine-tuned doctrine. Theological warfare was the only militancy of these peace-loving Dutchmen, and afterward it was always time for their borreltje, enjoying boerenjongens, branded raisins, or perhaps brandewijn met suiker, always out of their best glasses. Sundays were always peaceful and quiet, no distractions of any kind, quiet and regular and uneventful. Most foods had been prepared the day before, and even eaten cold op Sundag. A delicious rest from all labor. Delft has been called a sweet little town with a bridge and a river in every street. Peace and quiet reign over the city, where the country's heroes are buried. In the dim vastness of the Nieuwe Kerk lies the dust of William the Silent. the father of the United Netherlands. He was assassinated just across the street. Probably his greatest tribute was that even the little children cried in the streets when he was laid to rest. There were two famous dogs in his life. The first woke his master when two Spanish assassins crept into his tent. The second dog refused to eat after his master was killed. He simply preferred starving rather than serving a lesser master. Also buried here is the national hero Piet Hein, who in reality was a common pirate. He captured the Spanish silver fleet together with 12 million guilders, making his country instantly wealthy. And then there's the tomb of Martin Tromp, that redoubtable sea dog, who nailed a broom to the mast of his ship, showing that he would sweep the sea of Englishmen. He won 33 sea battles, but died in the final moments of his last victory. Rare is the Dutch home that doesn't have flowers on the table or window box. In rural areas, a house simply is not a home without a garden of flowers. This country exports more flowers than all the rest of the world put together. As the Dutch merchants sailed the world's oceans, they brought back new varieties of plants. And soon Dutch gardens set the standard for all of Europe. The tulip is thought to have come from Asia and by way of Turkey made its way to Holland. And by the end of the 1600s, a garden full of tulips was a sure sign of luxury, prestige, and social standing. This was a time of rabid speculation in bulbs. The craze became known as tulip mania, or the wind trade, because nothing in the market reflected any true value of the bulbs, hence trading the wind. As the wealth trickled down to the middle classes, the speculative frenzy in bulbs increased even more. Family fortunes were made and eventually wiped out in the bidding fever. At one point, a white-flamed Semper Augustus tulip bulb sold for 9,000 guilders. Churches echoed with sermons on the evils of bulb gambling, but that only made it worse. In due course, things dropped back to normal. In fact, the rose soon replaced the tulip as the best-selling flower. Today, new tulip varieties come from tissue culture that are started in test tubes. The ingenious laboratories are even working on infertile plants so that the competition cannot profit from their research and produce flowers identical to the ones they purchased. Raising tulips today is a steady business. It certainly doesn't have that element of romance as the days when Cornelius van Barrel grew his black tulip and won at the same time 100,000 florins and the hand of the woman he loved. It was all because of the river, the Rhine River, which made Dordrecht at one time the richest city in the land. All wines and goods were taxed before passing into the country. It was called privilege of staple and lasted some 100 years. However, downriver, Rotterdam grew envious and would tolerate it no longer. They took up arms and forced Dordrecht to waive the privilege, leaving her an old but far more beautiful city. The bells of the massive kirk summon her members to church, and people scurry from the shadows to enter the ancient doors, from whence swells the most indescribable harmony. We now walk the old harbor of Enkhuizen, dominated by the old double-humped dromedair's tower, a relic of the ancient walls. The carillons ring sweetly overhead as we sit on the old seawall and watch the darkening water. Enkhuizen does homage to the herring. At one time, this city had one of the largest fishing fleets in the country. It was their unprejudiced belief that herring in het land, doctor on den kant, or a herring a day keeps the doctor away. Here lived Holland's finest seamen, their reputation so great that the German Emperor Charles V and even his Dutch-hating son would have no other than Enkhuizen sailors on his royal ship. Windmills came to Holland as a result of the Crusades and were first used for milling grain. It was not until 200 years later that they started using them for pumping water. Mills will vary in size from mere toys rattling away pumping water in the ditches to mammoth structures producing over 50 horsepower, sawing lumber or grinding grain or pumping water, with, of course, plenty of room for the miller's family as well. During the 12th century in Overijssel, there was a lawsuit between the Lord of Worst and the monastery. The old feudal master claimed that he owned Boreas and all his breath that blew over the fields. The bishop who judged the proceedings ruled in favor of Lord Worst, forcing the monastery to pay a tax for the winds that swept the fields and powered the windmills, creating the folklore and proverbs of trading the wind. If the Netherlands were to rely on these ancient landmarks to pump their country dry, it would only have been a drop in the bucket. Real progress only began in 1852, when steam pumps began pumping the Haarlemmermeer. The next step in progress were the huge diesel engines that now are totally outdated by giant electric motors, the largest in the world, with the unbelievable capacity of pumping 330,000 gallons per minute. Yet I never grow weary of watching those great sails whirling in the distance, looking for all the world as though they were walking across the country in 7-league boots. Lovely swans give the canals a stately elegance. The Dutch are practical people. In times of severe hunger, the swans would magically disappear, only to reappear on the dinner table as roasted goose. The fields are separated by long ditches. Time was saved by simply hopping across on poles rather than travel to the distant bridge. It is difficult to imagine anything more home-like than the cozy homes of Holland. Every house has its garden, and as you travel along the tree-bordered road past red-roofed houses, you know that life is comfortable enough here. But as the years have passed, the Hollander pays a heavy penalty for all its government. More than half his income goes for taxes. Overall, about 2/3 of the Dutch national product is redistributed by the government. The country wasn't always that prosperous, even for the country's royalty. The first William of Orange only left his heirs 12 guilders. However, fortunes for the House of Orange have considerably improved. Queen Beatrix is the second richest woman in all Europe, worth about $5 billion US. Even though she can be deposed by a simple vote of Parliament, she is always above controversy and dearly beloved by her loyal subjects. But getting back to the lovely homes, the farmhouses in most parts of the country are quaint and picturesque, with tile or thatched roofs. In Groningen, they hardly resemble farmhouses, but are almost country seats. How different from the old sod-cutter homes in Drenthe. These plaggenwoningen had ceilings about 5 feet tall, with hay stored above. At one end of the house lived the family. The roof was covered with sod, and a hole in it served as a chimney for the peat fire on the floor below. In those times, nothing was thought of sharing space with livestock. It was considered to be healthy. It was honestly claimed that consumptive patients were cured by sleeping in cowsheds. This primitive system was cheap, for cows gave off so much heat that fires were used only for cooking food. The homes in Hindelopen were stately. Now these had class. In the living room was a bed called the prunkbeden, or show bed. They were never slept in. Some parlors were used only op Sondag. Friesland means the land of free people, and they have fought for that freedom ever since they clambered off Noah's Ark. Even Julius Caesar spoke with respect about these intrepid Barians who lived on a floating island midst the furies of the North Sea. The Frisians are one of the very few original Germanic tribes that have neither changed name or place. The Romans had a terrible time beating them in battle, and later the Frisians simply refused to pay taxes. So the Romans left. It simply wasn't worth all the trouble. The Frisian language has Germanic roots, but is more similar to English. They will speak Frisian at home and perhaps Dutch at work, but on the streets you will hear a town Frisian where he will switch from Frisian to Dutch from sentence to sentence or word to word, depending on which one will give the best expression. The Frisians were sometimes the butt of jokes because of their rural ways. The Groningers, perhaps to compensate for their own sense of inferiority, were particularly fond of telling Frisian jokes, and the Frisians would tell the same ones about their neighbors. In the Holland we remember, there have always been the tales of the old Zuider Zee, and it certainly has a unique and remarkable history. In the Middle Ages, the Zuider Zee was a great forest. And in the middle of that forest was a lake called Flavo by the Romans. In the 13th century, a tremendous storm and flood swallowed the forest, the lake, and villages, forming the new Zuider Zee. It was deep at first. Ocean-going vessels sailed it, and on the banks grew important towns such as Enkhuizen, Hoorn, and Blokzeil. But then the Zuider Zee began to silt once more, till in our own lifetime it was diked and severed from the sea. For the Dutch, the marketplace, as well as the church, was the center of social life. Towns grew around the marketplace. The oldest buildings, the town hall, the way house, and church, always looked down on it. One day a week, and sometimes more often, the cobblestones were covered by little booths for the market. In the summer evenings, the town band would play a weekly concert. Here were the fresh vegetables, the waffelen and poffertjes being devoured in appalling quantities. You notice the eel for sale, and you see how it's done. The head in one hand with the tail in the other, and you tear it off with your teeth. This is the land of cheese eaters. Who else would be satisfied with a chunk of cheese and bread for breakfast? As they say in Holland, dessert without cheese is like a beautiful woman with only one eye. The somber church tower tells us the hour of day and the brevity of life by playing some Genevan psalm. Any good burgomaster will tell you that good schools and good bells are the sign of a well-managed city. A few hundred years ago, those who became wealthy from the East India trade retired to live in Arnhem, which was considered the earthly paradise for Dutchmen. For them, hills and forest were a luxury. Arnhem was always considered an ideal spot for a sojourn. There was an old Holland saying that substantiated this: Nijmegen de oudste, Roermond de stoutste, Zutphen de rijkste, maar Arnhem de genoegeloofste. Nijmegen the oldest, Roermond the fattest, Zutphen the richest, but Arnhem is the most enjoyable. But glancing back over this city, much has changed. So great was the destruction from the last war. As the German troops headed south in defeat to protect their own country, the flow suddenly stopped, and to the horrible realization of the people, the British were not coming and the Germans were not going. And the great battle for the bridge too far was about to begin. The British overruled and ignored the Dutch underground warnings, and as a result, there were 17,000 Allied casualties, and the Dutch civilians suffered 10,000 dead or wounded, with hunger winter following. Smoking occupies a great deal of a Dutchman's life. I remember a Dutchman saying that he always carried 2 clay pipes to the field. One of the pipes would always be cooling in the moist soil at each end of the field. Not only did they smoke the daylight hours, but the ever-present chewing tobacco would be consumed, often at the same time. Smoking, they said, was the Dutchman's second breath, and a cigar was the Dutchman's 6th finger. This story is told of Papa Van Claes in Rotterdam, who retired with a good income and spent his last days in comfort, surrounded by whirls of smoke. Anyone who visited him never came away without pocketfuls of cigars and tobacco. Before he died, Papa called his lawyer. He told him, "My dear Pete, my time is about up. Fill your pipe and mine. I'm about ready to kick the bucket. Let's get down to business and write my will." In his will, he invited all the smokers of Holland to his funeral. Every smoker was to get 10 pounds of tobacco and 2 pipes. "Everyone who follows my casket to the graveyard," he said, "will receive a year's supply of tobacco. Everyone shall smoke continuously through the ceremony, and when my casket is lowered in the ground, every person shall drop thereon their ashes." The will of Meneer was carried out religiously. Even his old cook, despite her aversion to tobacco, was seen smoking a cigar, although she became quite ill. Now, the country never erected a monument to Van Claes, but his memory is secure in the legend of Papa Grootpiep. When Middelburg was the richest and most powerful city in the Netherlands. At the Rouen-Saccade, French ships came with wines. At the London-Saccade, English ships unloaded cargoes of wool. Those quays still remain, their names unchanged, but alas, the ships which once crowded them have sailed away, never to return. Middelburg's ancient glory has departed, but now she lies a quiet, sleepy, beautiful town. There is the story of little Peter, a sly waterlander who lived in the village of Den Ilp. During the War for Independence, a Spanish captain and 20 soldiers tried to sneak through and capture the village. On this rainy night, they ran into an impasse. At the end of the peninsula, they came on little Peter as he was fishing. The captain ordered the fishermen to row his soldiers to the village. Little Peter obediently took the first load of heavily armed musketeers. They were very cumbersome and had to stand in the little pram. Through sheets of rain and winding waterways, out of earshot of the others, he neared a deep area where the little pram began to rock and roll, spilling the heavily armed Spanish, who plunged to the bottom like lead. Little Peter would retrieve his pram and swim to shore, and after carefully wringing out his clothes, he went back for his next consignment, doing this 7 times. Needless to say, the attack on Watergang was abandoned. The Urk of today is a prosperous town. It is claimed to have more millionaires per population than any other city in the country, all of which happened after the Afsluit Dike. But 100 years ago, as an island in the middle of the Zuiderzee, this place was far from prosperous. The people lived on the island like hermits. They saw no one. They wished to see no one. Many of the women lived and died here without once seeing the mainland. At that time, life on Urk was incredibly hard and desolate. First was the never-ending battle with the North Sea, and there was little room for farming, no source of income or food but from the sea. When fishing was good, they ate fish and potatoes, but what they ate when fishing was bad, heaven only knows. Everyone was related in some degree to everyone else. It was a disgrace for a man to go outside his village for a wife. This, incidentally, was quite true all over Holland. It was the unwritten rule that a man must get his wife from among his own people. In other places this might be acceptable, but in Urk the inbreeding was disastrous. How different from the bustling, lovely city of Urk today. The world took no notice in 1609. The baby, because he was born along the Rhine River, was named Van Ryn, Rembrandt van Ryn. He was to become perhaps the most famous painter the world has ever known. His greatest work could not be sold for millions because it is owned by the Netherlands as a national treasury. These are the pastoral landscapes viewed and painted by Rembrandt van Ryn. His very breath was landscape and portrait, spending all his money to teach and create paintings. At the time of his wife's death, he painted his greatest masterpiece, The Night Watch. After years of loneliness and extreme poverty, a forgotten man except for his creditors, he died a pauper and was buried at the cost of 13 guilders, paid for by his friends. In the Holland we remember, we have probably overlooked the country many of our grandparents wish to forget. They say that nostalgia is history without guilt. But in fairness, I must say that my grandfather left a country he never revisited or even wished to return. It was much the same all over Europe. Rents were high and wages low. Peasants had to sell their land and then rent them back at high rates. A rigid class system between landowner and worker. No opportunities or future. And those who headed for Canada and America earned wealth beyond their wildest dreams. Yet woven through the fabric of memory were the old scenes, the old traditions and customs that are part of our lives. These are the things that make us a civilized people. The old songs we sang, the stories we told, the food we ate, the religious faith that was carried to the New World. In all these things we laugh at its shortcomings, but we find comfort and stability in its strengths. Our grandparents, despite all shortcomings and peculiarities, lived by golden rules and traditions that made them solid citizens in the New World. They were men of the Heidelberg Catechism. And when they left for the New World, they collected their traditions, their creeds, their beliefs, leaving nothing behind but the bare landscape. And after they had settled in the New World, they would remain more faithful to the old beliefs than did those who stayed behind. In their stern Calvinism, they were stubborn and inflexible, but that same resoluteness gave a faith that allowed them to live and die happily. And it all began here in the Holland we remember. Over the cobblestone streets of her towns and the gray waters of her meres, there hangs the fugitive poetry of Dutch skies, those shifting, exquisite skies that are never the same. And as we gaze across the fields that have been tilled and planted by those we have known and loved, and those who have long since been forgotten, there is that special feeling of birthright. And here it all began, in the Holland we remember.